Greetings everybody out there in YouTube land. This is your buddy Lyle at C&S Corvettes in Sarasota, Florida, back with another exciting, interesting, and hopefully valuable and informative video for you guys about Corvette stuff. I've had several questions, comments, and requests to do a rundown of the differences and the specifics on the 63 to 67 Corvettes, often called the mid-year Corvettes, as they aren't, I haven't covered those before because they aren't really driven regularly. They're much more valuable show car type of cars at this point, but people want to know, so I'm here to tell them. But before we get started with that, if you would take the time to please like and subscribe this video, it really helps us out when you do that. It allows us to keep doing this and bringing you more free information that hopefully helps you enjoy the Corvette hobby as much as we do. Now, back to the mid-year Corvettes. So let me first take you back to the dewy slopes of 1962. 1962 Corvette, last year of what we call the straight axle cars, because they had, say it with me, straight axle rear ends. They were very primitive as far as performance, as far as what we would consider modern automotive engineering. A lot of that stuff was kind of carryovers from even the 1953 Corvette. Which was, again, very, very, very basic. With the 1963 Corvette, a bunch of really brilliant dudes at GM, including people like Larry Shinoda and, of course, Zora Arkus-Duntov, were working diligently to bring the Corvette up to world-class performance levels. In that search, they added a bunch of really, at that time, avant-garde things to these cars. They wanted a car with both independent front and rear suspension. The only other car that had it in the world at that time was the Jaguar XKE. It is a very good system for cornering. It is a very good system for road racing. And after all, that's what Zora Arkus-Duntov loved to do. So these cars were designed to not only look like the future, but to actually be engineered like the future. And in late 1962, early 1963, when GM developed and unveiled the new 1963 Corvette, no one could believe what a beautiful car they had made. There had never been anything like this made before in America. Nothing remotely close to the shape, feel, style, and performance of this car. As you all know, anyone who's ever known anything about Corvettes knows, 1963, the coupe had what we called the split window design. It had that fiberglass spine down the center of the rear window that carried that ridge all the way down to the rear of the car. Iconic design, only 1 year. It was actually eliminated in 1964, but we'll get to that. So in 1963, when they introduced the Corvette, you had the coupe or the soft top convertible. Engines were all 327 cubic inch V8s, ranging in horsepower from 250 all the way up to 360 horses with the fuel injected V8. Fuel injection back then was a much more mechanical thing than it is today. As a matter of fact, if you look at this picture right here of the fuel injected engine from a 63, you can see that it looks very, very, very different from a normal V8 of that period. And there are still a handful of specialists in America who do nothing but tune and rebuild just these fuel injection units because they're that specialized. Transmission options were either a 2-speed Power Glide automatic or a 4-speed manual transmission, and they switched from Borg-Warner to Muncie 3 or 4 months into production. So you could, early car could have had a different 4-speed. Some optional things that we associate with those cars, knockoff wheels. Those really beautiful wheels with the 3-point spinners on them. They were technically available as an option in 1963. However, due to some production issues with wheels leaking and getting loose and falling off of cars because they hadn't perfected the locking mechanisms yet, only about 13 sets were ever sold to the public according to Chevrolet records. By 1964, it was readily available, and a lot of people chose them because they look fantastic. Also in 1963, you had the first appearance of what we all know today as the Z06 Performance Special Equipment Group. There was a bunch of stuff that kind of folded into that special equipment group, some of which was a 36-gallon fiberglass gas tank. Imagine that today. Close ratio 4-speed, transmission, fuel injection, oversized fin brake drums and brake cooling ducts. Basically, the Z06 was, if you wanted a Corvette race car from the factory, you ordered this specific option and you were pretty well set up to grab your helmet and your gloves and go to the track. The Z06s are obviously enormously valuable today, as are any of the split window coupes, but you will see that the Z06 name was carried on quite far into the C5, the C6, the C7, and now coming up the C8 Corvette. The Z06 has become synonymous with the track-focused version of the Corvette. In 1963, there were 10,594 coupes made, and there were 10,919 convertibles. Moving on to 1964, we have same body styles, very few changes. In 1963, they had the simulated air vents in the hood, which were eliminated for 64. The rear split in the window for the coupes was eliminated in 1964. Same transmissions, basically the same engine options. The fuel injection picked up another 10 horses to go to 375 horses. Knockoff wheels were readily available. And there were 8,304 coupe and 13,925 convertibles made. Now, there's kind of an invisible dividing line between 63, 64 and 65, 67. Here's why. Two big things happened in 1965. Number one, they converted all Corvette production to disc brakes. Another way ahead of its time thing, because every other American car was running on drums, like they all had, for decades. So going to disc brakes, much more efficient braking, easier cooling, better brake feel, again, pushing us further into that top echelon of performance. And on that note, we also have the addition of this small little thing we like to call the big block Chevy engine. In 1965, the 396 cubic inch, 425 horse engine was introduced as an option in the Corvette. It was a beast. There had not been an engine like that in a sports car in America at all. And honestly, at the time, I don't think there was anything in the world that could have competed with that for just pure grunt at low RPMs. You could always tell back in the day when the cars were still largely original, you could tell a big block because it had this extra hood bulge to make room for the taller air cleaner, the taller intake manifold on the 65 big block. That hood was used in 65 and 66, and then in 67 they went to the Stinger hood, which we'll get to in a minute. Other exciting things, 1965 was the last year that mechanical fuel injection was available, and they didn't mess around with fuel injection again until all the way till 1982 when they came out with the throttle body injection, which they called crossfire injection, and those of us who have to work on it call ceasefire injection in 1982. And side note, what year did Corvette offer its first power antenna? Answer, say it with me, 1965. There were 8,186 coupes made, and there were 15,378 convertibles. You'll notice how in 63, as I've given you these numbers, coupe and convertible production were pretty much even. 64, it took a huge slant toward the convertibles, and then that continued all the way through the end of production in 1967. For a long time, everybody wanted convertibles, and then starting in like mid-2000s, when the collector car stuff really got rolling and everybody had money, the coupes started making a comeback because they were more rare and by some considered to be much more beautiful. Moving on to 1966, there weren't a great deal of changes in the cars themselves. They look very similar to the 1965s. Couple of little things. The big block moved from 396 cubic inches to 427 cubic inches. And they also introduced what they called their tri-power carburetor setup for the Corvette. Now, they had played with 3 carburetors in a line on other cars like Pontiac GTOs and stuff, but this was the first time it was used on the Corvette. The idea being that in normal putting around town, you ran off the center carburetor, and when you hit the loud pedal, all three carburetors opened up to give you a big shot of fuel and air and really improve performance. In truth, if you've ever had to live with a tri-power, you know that you are constantly fiddling with them, trying to keep all three carburetors in tune. And while it is a beautiful and interesting mechanical setup, modern fuel injection makes everything so much easier. It is it's romantic, it isn't effective. 1966, also backup lights became standard. So instead of having 4 round red tail lights, you had 2 red tail lights at the outside, and the inboard lights, which had been red, were now clear, and they were now your backup lights. 9,958 coupes made, 17,762 convertibles. Again, you see that space between coupe and convertible production growing again in 66. Moving on into the final year of production for the mid-years, 1967, we get probably the most iconic version of this car other than the split window in 63, the original. 67, they did a beautiful Stinger hood for the big block that really added a different dimensional look to the front of the car. They got rid of a bunch of the chrome extraneous badging. It was a very clean outside package. The 427 big block was still available, of course, and you could have it in several different varieties. There was a 400 horse version if you wanted air conditioning. If you didn't want air conditioning, you could get that same engine with 435 horses. But they also had 2 other options. The L89 option, which allowed you to get aluminum heads put onto your big block, or the L88 option, which was basically a racing motor for the street. It ran off a single carburetor as opposed to the tri-power setup, and it made, according to GM, 430 horsepower. That is a cause for a great deal of laughter by anyone who knows the history of the L88. No one will actually say how much power those cars actually made, but 430 was very, very conservative. My personal opinion, I think it was closer to 5 or 520, but they were unbelievably powerful. The park brake was removed from under the instrument cluster to between the seats for the first time, and all the way through the end of, I think it was certainly C6, I think C7 production, the park brake lever remained between the seats somewhere. The reverse lamp was moved from being the inner 2 tail lights. Those tail lights went back to being 4 red ones, and now you had a white rectangular lens in the center of the rear fascia that was your backup light. They also switched, they got away from the knock-on wheels, the true, put them on, put the spinner on, and put the pin in to hold them in place, to wheels that look very similar to knockoff wheels, but were actually bolt-on wheels, and that's what they were called. If you talk about a 67 Corvette, those are bolt-on wheels. There were 8,504 coupe, 14,436 convertibles made. So that's all of the hard, dry data. I want to take a minute to talk to you about the differences in those cars as we view them today. Remember I mentioned that big dividing line between 63.4 and 65.67? The 63 cars, especially the split windows, have that real collector cachet because of the iconic split window. 63 convertibles, unless they're fuelies, and 64s in general, unless they're fuelies or 365 horse high horse cars, are kind of the least valuable of the 63-7 run because they still had the drum brakes. They didn't have some of the more modern amenities that make them usable on today's roads and today's traffic. Drum brakes, even at their best, were not great. They were more a suggestion to your car than direct input. And I think that's why you see the 63 non-split window 63s and the 64s maintain. They're still worth good money, don't get me wrong, but they don't reach the ridiculous heights that we've seen some of the other later cars get to, other than the split window. 65, 6, and 7 are still very much modern cars as far as their mechanics go. In fact, the chassis underneath a 65 Corvette was pretty much the same, unchanged all the way up through 1982, and nobody would blink twice at driving a 80 Corvette to the grocery store or 50 miles away to go visit a friend. So they are still very usable today. To prognosticate about which direction values are going on these cars? Yeah, up. That's where they're going. They are not rising at the meteoric rate of, say, a 2018 Honda, or that's up like 40% over the last year and a half. But you can always count on these cars creeping up in value incrementally all the time because they're rare, they're desirable, and because of attrition. Every year we lose a few of them one way or another. The downside to these cars is the expense in taking a car that is and making it nice. Because let's say you went to buy a 64 coupe that ran and drove and was a complete car, but the paint was kind of yucky, the interior was kind of ugly, everything was just kind of tired, and you wanted to make this a nice car. You're going to spend somewhere between 35 and 40 grand for that car. And you're going to spend somewhere between $50,000 and $80,000 minimum to bring it up to wow standards. And by the time you've added that $50,000 to $80,000 to the $35,000 to $40,000, and you've got your car back from the shop after 2 years of work and it's gorgeous, you have a really lovely $65,000 car. Now, if you followed me on the math there, you just heard that you just lost a boatload of money restoring this car. That's correct. So the number one lesson I want you to take from today is, if you want one of these cars, I don't care what year, I don't care what engine, buy it done. Buy the nicest car you can get your hands on. Buy the freshly restored car. Buy the one that needs nothing, because you are going to pay through the nose for it, but you're going to get to enjoy it, and you're not going to have to invest thousands upon thousands upon thousands of dollars to make it nice. That is my number one hint for today. If you have a car like this and you want to send me pictures, or you want to send questions about these cars in particular, please feel free to reach out to me on email, Lyle at CorvettePartsCenter.com, and I look forward to seeing what you guys have to say. I love these cars dearly, and I really hope that if you haven't had the opportunity to get a ride in a 63 to 67 Corvette, find somebody in a Corvette club local to you and go for one. The view from the windshield, the smell, and the experience are really, really worth it. I hope you guys have a great weekend, and I'll talk to you soon.